In an abandoned house deep in a dense forest, a man in an expensive suit places a newborn baby on the dusty floor. The desperate cries of the child echo through the peeling walls as the millionaire businessman coldly looks at the baby one last time before leaving. What he doesn't know is that a majestic white horse grazing near the forest has heard the child's cries and is heading toward the abandoned house. When the animal enters and finds the baby crying desperately on the cold floor, it makes an unbelievable decision. Before we begin, if you, like us, are an animal lover, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any of our thrilling stories. Thank you. Now, back to our story. The sound of expensive tires crushing dry twigs echoed through the dense woods like a dark omen. Edward Montgomery adjusted the knot of his Italian silk tie as the driver navigated the Mercedes along the narrow tracks that snaked between ancient trees. His hands trembled imperceptibly, not from fear, but from a calculated anxiety that had been consuming him for weeks. "Stop here," he commanded in a clipped voice as they spotted the silhouette of the abandoned homestead among the moss-covered trunks. The rotting wooden structure looked like a ghost from a bygone era, its broken windows reflecting fragmented pieces of the grey sky. The boards groaned under the pressure of the wind that whispered through the dead leaves, creating a melancholic symphony that made Edward clench his fists inside the pockets of his impeccable suit. The driver hesitated for a moment, watching his boss in the rearview mirror. "Mr. Montgomery, are you sure you want to do this? There's still time to—" "Be quiet," Edward interrupted, his dark eyes glinting with a blood-chilling coldness. "You're not paid to think. You're paid to obey and to forget." The man lowered his head in silence as Edward exited the vehicle with precise movements, carrying a bundle in his arms that stirred slightly. The white fabric wrapped around the child contrasted brutally with the darkness that dwelled in the millionaire businessman's heart. Each step toward the abandoned house echoed like a sentence being pronounced. The smell of rotten wood mingled with the damp aroma of decaying leaves, creating an atmosphere that seemed to suck all hope from the air. Edward shoved the front door with his shoulder, causing it to groan in protest. The interior of the house was plunged into a sickly gloom. Cobwebs swayed like ghostly veils between the ceiling beams, and small animals scurried into the dark corners. The loose floorboards moaned under the weight of his steps, as if the house itself were weeping for the cruelty about to be committed. Edward stopped in the center of the main room and looked around with disdain. "Perfect," he muttered to himself, "a place where no one would ever think to look." With mechanical movements, he bent down and placed the bundle on the cold floor. Immediately, a desperate, high-pitched cry cut through the forest silence like a sharp knife. The sound was pure, innocent, pleading, the very opposite of everything Edward represented. The newborn baby flailed its tiny arms, its small lungs struggling to express an anguish it barely understood. Tears welled from eyes that had not yet seen enough of the world to understand they were already being rejected by it. Edward stood motionless for a few seconds, observing the child with an empty expression. There was no remorse in his eyes, only the cold satisfaction of someone who had just solved a bothersome problem. "You should never have existed," he said in a low voice, almost a whisper. "Your existence is a threat I cannot afford." The baby's cry intensified, echoing off the peeling walls and out through the broken windows, spreading through the forest like a cry for help that only the ancient trees could witness. Every tear that streamed down the helpless little face seemed to accuse Edward of a cruelty he refused to acknowledge. Without a final glance, the businessman turned and walked toward the exit. His footsteps echoed like hammers against the conscience he had chosen to silence long ago. The door creaked shut behind him, sealing the innocent child's fate. Outside, near the edge of the woods, a majestic white horse raised its head upon hearing the desperate cries that pierced the air. Its ears twitched nervously, catching every nuance of the suffering that emanated from the abandoned house. And something deep in its animal instinct was awakened. What Edward Montgomery didn't know was that he had just set in motion a chain of events that would change the destiny of everyone involved forever. The white horse named Tempest had been grazing peacefully in the clearing near the woods when the first cries cut through the afternoon air. His pointed ears perked up instantly, catching every nuance of the sound coming from the direction of the abandoned homestead. It was not the cry of a wounded animal. It was something different, more urgent, more desperate. Tempest raised his majestic head, his nostrils flaring to catch any scent that might explain the distressing sound. The wind brought only the familiar smells of the forest, damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sweet fragrance of wildflowers growing among the trees. The animal took a few hesitant steps toward the sound, his large hooves treading softly on the carpet of dry leaves. Something in his primal instinct warned him that this cry needed immediate attention. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a deep call that echoed in his animal soul. The cries continued, growing weaker and more intermittent, as if the source of that anguish was losing strength. Tempest snorted nervously, shaking his white mane that shone like silver under the sunbeams filtering through the treetops. Without further hesitation, the horse began to gallop toward the abandoned house. His hooves beat a rhythmic tattoo against the forest floor, creating a sound that contrasted with the ominous silence that had settled after the cries temporarily ceased. When he reached the clearing where the house stood like an open wound in the bucolic landscape, Tempest stopped abruptly. His nostrils quivered as he scented the air, detecting a recent human smell mixed with something else, the unmistakable scent of a newborn. The door to the house was closed, but the broken windows allowed sounds and smells to escape freely. Tempest circled the structure slowly, investigating every possible entry. His dark, intelligent eyes scanned every detail, as if assessing the best course of action. It was then that the cries started again, weaker now, almost whispers of despair. The sound made something inside Tempest's chest ache. It was as if each of the child's tears echoed directly in his animal heart, awakening a protective instinct he had never before experienced. The horse approached the main door and, with care, pushed it with his muzzle. The rotten wood gave way easily, groaning in protest as it swung open. The gloom of the interior contrasted sharply with the golden, late-afternoon light filtering through the trees. Tempest hesitated for a moment on the threshold, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The baby's scent was stronger now, mixed with the odor of fear and abandonment that permeated the stale air. His hooves made a dull thud against the loose floorboards as he entered cautiously. In the center of the main room, on the cold, dirty floor, lay a small white bundle that was moving faintly. The whimpers coming from it were so quiet they were almost lost in the creaking of the old wood. Tempest approached slowly, lowering his majestic head to investigate. What he saw deeply disturbed him. It was a human baby, no more than a few hours old, left there like a disposable object. Its tiny eyes were closed, but tears still streamed down its rosy cheeks. Its little arms flailed weakly, searching for something. Warmth, comfort, protection. Without a second thought, Tempest carefully lay down beside the child, offering the warmth of his large, strong body. Immediately, the whimpering began to subside. The baby, sensing the comforting presence and the heat emanating from the animal, gradually began to calm down. The horse remained motionless, breathing softly, his vigilant eyes watching the child's every move. It was as if he had taken on a sacred mission to protect this innocent life that someone had cruelly abandoned to its fate. As the hours passed and night began to fall over the forest, Tempest kept his silent vigil, determined to let no harm befall the helpless child. Night fell upon the forest like a heavy cloak, bringing with it a symphony of nocturnal sounds that contrasted with the tense silence inside the abandoned house. Tempest remained lying beside the baby, his large, warm body serving as a protective shield against the cold that seeped through the broken windows. The horse had not moved a single muscle since positioning himself beside the child. His eyes remained alert, scanning every shadow that danced on the peeling walls whenever the full moon emerged from behind the clouds. Every sound from the forest, the distant howl of coyotes, the creaking of branches in the wind, the rustling of small animals among the leaves, made his ears perk up in a state of high alert. The baby had stopped crying a few hours ago, finding solace in the warmth and comforting presence of its unlikely guardian. Its small hands instinctively clutched at the soft hair on Tempest's chest, as if recognizing that this magnificent creature was its only anchor of safety in a world that had already rejected it. But as the hours dragged on, a new problem began to manifest. The baby started to stir restlessly, its tiny lips making sucking motions in the air. The primal instinct of hunger was awakening, and Tempest immediately noticed the change in the child's behavior. First came the small, almost imperceptible whimpers, like whispers of need. The horse raised his head, his dark eyes studying the little face that was beginning to contort in discomfort. He could feel the baby's body temperature rising slightly, signaling the onset of a different kind of distress. Tempest shifted carefully, trying not to disturb the child, but knowing he had to do something. His animal instincts warned him that this little being needed something he could not provide. Food. The thought left him deeply unsettled, a feeling of helplessness that was entirely new to him. The baby's whimpers gradually turned into low cries, then into desperate wails that cut through the silence of the night like sharp blades. Each cry seemed to pierce Tempest's heart, awakening in him an urgency he had never experienced. The horse stood up carefully, taking care not to step on the child. His hooves made dull thuds against the floorboards as he positioned himself to protect the baby from any predator that might be attracted by the cries. But that didn't solve the main problem, the growing hunger that was consuming the child. It was then that Tempest made a decision that would change everything. He raised his majestic head toward the roof of the house and let out a loud, powerful neigh that echoed through the forest like a battle cry. The sound reverberated through the trees, crossed clearings, skirted hills, and spread across the surrounding rural area like a natural emergency siren. He neighed again, even louder, with an intensity that sent small animals scurrying and startled nightbirds into flight from the treetops. It was not just a sound, it was a desperate call, a plea for help that carried all the urgency and desperation the animal felt. Between the neighs, the baby's cries continued, creating a symphony of despair that cut through the darkness of the night. Tempest alternated between lowering himself to offer warmth to the child and rising to let out new calls that echoed through the forest. The horse knew, by some deep instinct, that his voice could reach human ears that would be looking for him. Someone would come. Someone had to come, because this innocent child could not die of neglect as long as he had the strength to call for her. The full moon silently witnessed this extraordinary vigil, as an animal demonstrated a compassion and determination that shamed the cruelty of the one who should have protected the child from the very first moment of her existence. In the darkness of the forest, destiny was being rewritten by hooves and neighs of hope. 2 miles away, in a modest light blue clapboard house, John Carter was startled awake by a sound he knew better than his own voice. It was Tempest, his companion of 15 years, neighing in a way he had never heard before. It wasn't the cheerful morning neigh, nor the routine call at feeding time. It was something entirely different, laden with urgency and desperation. "Mary Ann, are you hearing this?" he whispered, gently touching the shoulder of his wife sleeping beside him. Mary Ann slowly opened her eyes, still groggy. "What is it, John? It's 2 in the morning?" Another neigh cut through the night, louder and more insistent than the last. Mary Ann sat up in bed immediately, her expression shifting from sleepy to concerned. She had known Tempest since he was a colt and knew this was not normal behavior. "Something's wrong," John said, already getting up and fumbling for his clothes in the dark. "Tempest has never made a sound like that. It's like he's calling for help." Mary Ann got up too, grabbing a shawl and heading to the window. The full moon partially illuminated the pasture where Tempest usually grazed during the day, but the horse was not there. "He's not in the pasture, John. Where could he have gone?" The couple had built a simple but happy life in the rural area. John worked as a mechanic in the nearby town, while Mary Ann tended a small vegetable garden and raised chickens. They never had much money, but they made up for it with love, dedication, and a deep connection to the nature around them. Tempest had come into their lives as an orphaned foal, found injured on the side of the road during a storm, hence his name. John had taken him home, and, together with Mary Ann, they had nursed him back to health. Since then, the horse had become more than a pet. He was part of the family. "I have to go look for him," John said, pulling on a plaid shirt and his work boots. "Something serious is happening." Tempest wouldn't leave the pasture at night without a reason. Mary Ann held his arm gently. "I'm coming with you. 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1, and you know Tempest trusts me too." John hesitated for a moment, knowing Mary Ann was right but worried about the dangers of the forest in the middle of the night. "All right, but we stick together, and let's grab the powerful flashlights." They prepared quickly, dressing in clothes suitable for a nighttime walk through the woods. John grabbed the large flashlight he used for late-night repairs, while Mary Ann took the smaller but equally efficient one she kept for emergencies. When they left the house, they could hear the neighs much more clearly. The sound was definitely coming from the direction of the dense forest, specifically from the area where the old abandoned homestead stood, a place everyone in the area knew of. But few ventured to visit. "Sounds like it's coming from the old homestead," Mary Ann said, frowning. "Why would Tempest go there?" John shook his head, equally confused. "I have no idea, but his calls are getting more desperate. We need to hurry." They began to walk quickly along the trail leading into the forest, their flashlights cutting through the darkness and creating circles of light that danced among the trees. The night air was cool and filled with the scent of night-blooming flowers that only blossomed under the moonlight. With each step, Tempest's neighs became clearer and more urgent. But there was something else, an almost imperceptible sound, mixed in with the horse's calls. Mary Ann stopped abruptly, causing John to turn back to her. "John, do you hear that? There's another sound with Tempest's neighs." They stood in silence for a few seconds, concentrating to catch any sound beyond the neighing. It was then that they both heard it at the same time, the faint, intermittent cry of a baby coming from the same direction as Tempest's calls. Their eyes met in the darkness, and both felt a shiver of premonition run down their spines. Something very serious was happening at the abandoned homestead. John and Mary Ann quickened their pace along the dark trail, their hearts pounding not just from the physical exertion, but from the growing certainty that something extraordinary awaited them at the abandoned house. The baby's cry, which they initially thought might have been their imagination, became clearer with every step. "Good God, John," Mary Ann whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "It really is a baby. How could there be a child at the old homestead?" John didn't answer immediately, concentrating on not tripping over the roots that spread across the uneven trail. His mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation for the situation. Who would leave a baby in an abandoned house in the middle of the woods? And why was Tempest there? When they finally reached the clearing where the house stood like a sinister shadow against the starry sky, the scene that greeted them left them speechless. The front door was ajar, and from within came not only Tempest's distressed neighs, but also the increasingly faint cries of a child. "A Tempest is inside the house," Mary Ann observed, her flashlight illuminating the dark entrance. He would never go into a building like that without a very serious reason. John approached the door carefully, calling softly for the horse. "Tempest, boy, we're here. What's going on?" A low, Almost relieved neigh came from inside, as if the animal were responding to his owner's call. John and Mary Ann exchanged a look before entering the house together, their flashlights revealing a scene that would be etched in their memories forever. In the center of the main room, Tempest was carefully lying next to a small white bundle. The horse raised his head when he saw his owners, his eyes reflecting the flashlight beams with an expression that seemed almost human, a mixture of relief, concern, and supplication. "Oh, my lord," Mary Ann murmured, placing a hand on her chest. "It's a baby, a real baby." John approached slowly, bending down to get a better look. The child couldn't be more than a few hours old, wrapped only in a white cloth that barely protected her from the cold. Her small fists were clenched, and dried tears stained her rosy cheeks. "Who would do something like this?" John asked, his voice thick with indignation and sadness. "Abandon a newborn out here alone, in the cold." Mary Ann knelt beside her husband, her maternal eyes immediately assessing the child's condition. "Oh, she's alive, John, but she needs urgent care. Look how pale and cold she is." Tempest neighed softly, as if explaining the situation to his owners. The horse stood up carefully, taking care not to step near the baby, and positioned himself protectively beside John and Mary Ann. "You protected her all night, didn't you, boy?" John said, affectionately stroking Tempest's mane. You knew she needed help and you called for us." Mary Ann had already extended her arms toward the baby, her maternal instincts overriding any hesitation. "We need to get her home immediately. She's hungry and cold. She needs milk, warmth, medical attention." When Mary Ann took the child in her arms with infinite gentleness, something magical happened. The baby, who had been crying intermittently all night, quieted almost instantly. It was as if she recognized that she was finally in safe hands, in arms that wanted and would protect her. "Look, John," Mary Ann whispered, tears beginning to stream down her face. "She's stopped crying. It's like she knows she's safe now." John watched his wife holding the child against her chest, and a wave of complex emotions washed over him. They had tried to have children for over 10 years, going through treatments, hopes, and disappointments. And now, completely unexpectedly, a child had come into their lives in the most improbable way possible. Tempest approached Mary Ann and stretched his neck to gently sniff the baby, as if making sure his little charge was truly in good hands. The gesture deeply touched the couple's hearts. "Let's go home," John said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "This child needs care we can only give her at home. And tomorrow we'll figure out how she ended up here." The walk back home felt both eternal and fleeting for John and Mary Ann. With every careful step they took on the dark trail, Mary Ann held the baby against her chest as if she were the most precious treasure in the world. Tempest followed them silently, his hooves making a soft sound against the earth as if he understood the solemnity of the moment. "She's so tiny," Mary Ann murmured, adjusting her shawl around the child to better protect her from the cold, pre-dawn wind. How could anyone abandon something so helpless and pure? John kept the flashlight steady, illuminating the path while watching his wife with a mixture of admiration and concern. He had known Mary Ann for 22 years, and he had never seen her so naturally maternal. It was as if all the years of waiting and frustration had been a preparation for this moment. When they finally reached their light blue house, Mary Ann went straight to the kitchen while John turned on all the lights. The modest but cozy home came to life with the child's presence. Mary Ann put water onto heat and began preparing a bottle with the powdered milk they kept for baking. "John, get those soft towels from the linen closet," Mary Ann instructed, her voice taking on a tone of maternal authority he had never heard. "And see if we have any diapers. I remember your sister left some here when her grandson stayed over last year." While John rushed around the house gathering the necessary items, Mary Ann carefully examined the baby under the bright kitchen light. The child was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, a regular, strong breath. She had fine, dark hair, and when she briefly opened her eyes, Mary Ann could see they were a deep brown. "You're a girl," Mary Ann whispered, feeling tears of joy run down her face. "A beautiful, perfect girl. What are we going to call you, little one?" John returned with his arms full of towels and a small box of diapers. "Found everything. And I also found that flannel nightgown my mom made for the baby that never came." John's words hung in the air for a moment. They both simultaneously remembered the hope they had cherished for years, the nurseries they had planned in their minds, the names they had chosen and kept in their hearts, and now, completely unexpectedly, a child was here, needing the very love they had to give. Mary Ann gave the baby her first bath in a small basin of warm water, her hands, experienced from caring for nieces and nephews, moving with natural confidence. The child whimpered only slightly, more from confusion than discomfort, and soon calmed down as Mary Ann began to hum a lullaby her own mother used to sing. "Ah, she trusts you," John observed, watching in amazement as his wife seemed to have been born for this moment. "It's like she knows you'll take good care of her." After the bath, Mary Ann dressed the baby in the flannel nightgown, which fit perfectly, and prepared the bottle to the ideal temperature. The child drank the milk with a desperate hunger, confirming she had gone hours without proper nourishment. While feeding the baby, Mary Ann looked at John with an expression that mixed determination and pleading. "John, I know this is complicated. We don't know where she came from, who her parents are, what happened. But, John encouraged, though he already knew what his wife was about to say, I can't just hand her over to the authorities without knowing if she'll be safe. What if the person who abandoned her tries to harm her again? What if she's put in an institution where she doesn't get the love she deserves?" John sat down beside his wife in the old rocking chair that had belonged to his grandmother. Tempest had positioned himself near the kitchen window, like a silent guardian who refused to stray far from his charge. "Mary Ann, are you suggesting that—" "I'm suggesting we care for her as if she were our own daughter," Mary Ann said firmly. "At least until we find out the truth about what happened. She needs love, care, a family, and we need her too." John looked at the serene face of the baby, who had fallen asleep in Mary Ann's arms after satisfying her hunger. A sense of fierce protection and instant love washed over him, surprising him with its intensity. Outside, the first ray of morning sun began to appear on the horizon, symbolizing a new beginning for all of them. A week had passed since that transformative night, and Edward Montgomery could find no peace. Sitting in his luxurious office in a downtown skyscraper, surrounded by expensive furniture and renowned artists' paintings, he nervously drummed his fingers on the mahogany desk while staring at the phone. Paranoia had become his constant companion. Every half-heard conversation, every glance he caught in his direction, every whisper at the country club, it all felt like a threat to his carefully constructed reputation. The weight of what he had done pressed on his conscience like a stone in his chest, not out of remorse, but out of fear of the consequences. "I have to be sure," he muttered to himself, grabbing his car keys. "I need to know my problem has been permanently solved." The decision to return to the abandoned homestead had been made after days of insomnia and growing anxiety. Edward couldn't just trust that nature had taken care of his problem. He needed visual confirmation, needed to see with his own eyes that no evidence of his cruelty remained. The Mercedes sped along the country roads under the strong midday sun. Edward had deliberately chosen a time when the area would be most deserted, when the locals would be at work or resting in their homes. He couldn't risk being seen near the abandoned house. When he reached the trail leading into the woods, Edward parked the car and continued on foot, his Italian loafers completely unsuited for the uneven terrain. Each step toward the house awakened a mix of anxiety and determination in him. He was there to definitively close this chapter of his life, but when he reached the clearing and saw the abandoned homestead, something was different. The door, which he was certain he had closed a week earlier, was ajar. Edward felt his heart race, but he tried to rationalize. It could have been the wind, wild animals, anything. He cautiously approached the entrance, pushing the door gently. The sunlight streaming through the broken windows immediately revealed what he feared most. The floor was bare. There was no sign of the baby, nor of the cloth that had wrapped her. It was as if the child had never been there. "No, no, no," Edward whispered. Rushing into the house and searching every corner, he scoured every room, examined every shadow, looked for any evidence of what had happened. But the house was completely empty. Panic began to take hold of him. Someone had found the child. Someone knew his secret. All the terrible possibilities began to unfold in his mind like a horror movie. What if the baby was alive? What if someone had taken her and was now investigating her origins? Edward stumbled out of the house, his breathing rapid and shallow. He looked around the clearing, searching for any clue as to what might have happened. It was then that he saw it. Hoofprints in the soft ground near the entrance of the house. Fresh prints, which were definitely not there when he had abandoned the child. "A horse," he murmured, analyzing the tracks. Someone came here on a horse. The discovery of the hoofprints completely changed the nature of his panic. It hadn't been a chance occurrence, a predator, or an accident. Someone had deliberately come to the house, possibly drawn by the child's cries, and that someone had taken the baby away. Edward began to pace in circles in the clearing, his calculating brain working furiously. He had to find out who had found the child. He had to know where she was now. And most importantly, he had to ensure that his role in the abandonment was never discovered. "I will find her," he said aloud, his voice taking on a tone of dark determination. "I will find out where she is, who has her, and I will make sure my secrets remain buried." As he walked back to his car, Edward was already formulating a plan. He would hire private investigators, the best money could buy. He would create a convincing story about a kidnapping or disappearance to justify his search. He would use all his influence and resources to track down the child. What Edward Montgomery didn't know was that his desperate search was about to put him on a collision course with people whose kindness and determination far surpassed his power and money, and that a white horse, driven by a protective instinct he could never comprehend, had been the first domino to fall in a chain of events that would change everything. The businessman drove back to the city with only one certainty. He would not rest until he had permanently resolved the problem that threatened to destroy everything he had worked for. 2 weeks had passed since John and Mary Ann Carter found the little girl they decided to name Hope. The choice of name had been natural. She represented exactly that for the couple who had lost hope of having children. The baby was growing healthy and happy, sleeping peacefully in the makeshift crib John had built with his own hands. Mary Ann had transformed into a devoted mother overnight. She woke every 3 hours to feed Hope, sang lullabies her own mother had sung to her, and spent hours watching the child's every little movement. John, in turn, had become a fiercely protective father, installing extra locks on the doors and windows, and always alert to any suspicious movement around the property. Tempest had taken on a unique role in the new family dynamic. The horse refused to wander far from the house, always grazing in spots where he could see the windows of the room where Hope slept. It was as if he had appointed himself the child's official guardian, a responsibility he took with absolute seriousness. That Thursday morning, as Mary Ann prepared Hope's bottle in the kitchen, John noticed something strange through the window. A dark sedan had stopped on the dirt road that ran in front of their property, a rare sight in this rural area where practically everyone knew each other. "Mary Ann, come look at this," John called, keeping his voice low so as not to wake the baby. Mary Ann approached the window, holding Hope in her arms. Outside, Two men in dark suits were talking beside the car, occasionally pointing toward the houses in the area. One of them held a clipboard and was making notes, while the other discreetly took photos with a professional camera. "Who are they?" Mary Ann whispered, instinctively pulling Hope closer to her chest. "I've never seen those men around here." John frowned, a feeling of unease growing in his chest. "They look like investigators or something. Look how they're documenting everything." The men remained in the area for over an hour, discreetly visiting neighboring houses and asking the residents questions. John and Mary Ann watched them from the window, noticing how Tempest had strategically positioned himself between the house and the road, his ears pricked in a state of alert. Around noon, the investigators finally approached their front door. John took a deep breath before answering, leaving Mary Ann and Hope in the back room, out of the visitors' sight. "Good morning, sir," said the taller man, flashing a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Rick Miller, private investigator. This is my colleague, Paul Fisher. We're investigating the possible kidnapping of a baby in the area." John felt his heart race, but he maintained a neutral expression. "Kidnapping? I haven't heard anything about that around here. This is a very quiet area." "Yes, we figured," Miller continued, consulting his notes. "The case happened about 2 weeks ago. A newborn baby disappeared under suspicious circumstances. We're checking to see if anyone in the area saw anything unusual or if any family has had, let's say, sudden changes." The investigators' words were carefully chosen, but the underlying threat was clear. John remained calm, though inside he felt a storm of emotions. "Sudden changes? Well," Fisher chimed in, "sometimes well-meaning people find abandoned children and decide to care for them without reporting it to the proper authorities. While the intention might be good, it could constitute a crime of concealing a minor." John felt a wave of anger surge through him. These men were clearly fishing for information, trying to scare the locals into revealing anything about a child. "I haven't seen anything strange around here," he said firmly, "and I can assure you none of my neighbors would be involved in a kidnapping." Miller smiled again, that same cold smile. Of course. But I'd like to ask a few routine questions, if you don't mind. Do you have any children, Mr. Carter?" "John Carter. And no, my wife and I don't have children." The lie came out naturally, driven by the protective instinct that had awakened in him. John noticed how the investigators' eyes darted around, trying to catch any evidence of a child's presence in the house. "I see," Miller said, making a note. "And that horse over there," he pointed to Tempest, "does he always stay so close to the house?" John looked at his faithful companion, who was watching them intently from the pasture. "Tempest is very protective, especially when strangers are around," Fisher chuckled humorlessly. "Interesting. And you haven't noticed anything unusual in the area? A baby crying, nighttime activity, strange people?" "Nothing," John replied flatly. The investigators exchanged a meaningful glance before Miller handed a card to John. "Well, if you remember anything or see anything suspicious, please contact us. There's a considerable reward for information leading to the child's recovery." After the men left, John remained at the door, watching their car disappear down the dirt road. His hands were trembling slightly as he finally closed the door and went to the back room where Mary Ann was waiting anxiously. "They know," Mary Ann whispered when John told her about the conversation. "Somehow they know someone found a baby." John hugged his wife and Hope, feeling the weight of the responsibility they had taken on. Outside, Tempest neighed softly, as if promising that he would let nothing bad happen to his makeshift family. On the other side of town, in a cheap motel in the roughest part of the city, Carla Mendoza clutched a cold cup of coffee in her trembling hands as she read the local newspaper article for the 10th time. "Family offers reward for information on missing baby," the headline read, accompanied by a photo she recognized immediately. It was Edward Montgomery, the man who had promised to care for her child. Carla was only 19, but the last few months had aged her young face with lines of worry and suffering. Her simple, worn clothes contrasted sharply with the luxurious environment where she had met Edward, back when she worked as a cleaner in one of his companies. The relationship had started as a romantic illusion, a powerful, wealthy man who seemed genuinely interested in her. Edward had been charming, attentive, making promises of a better future. Carla, an orphan since she was 15 and struggling to survive on her own, had fallen in love not just with the man, but with the security he represented. When she discovered she was pregnant, Carla was initially terrified, but Edward had reacted with surprising calm. "Don't worry," he had said, holding her hands with apparent affection. "I will take care of you and the baby. I'll never abandon you." The promises had multiplied in the following months. Edward spoke of a house where she and the child could live comfortably, of a quality education, of a future free from financial worries. Carla had dreamed of a real family, of stability, of love. But after the baby was born, everything changed drastically. Edward had visited the hospital only once, looking at the child with an expression Carla couldn't decipher at the time, but which she now recognized as disguised revulsion. "I need to sort out some legal matters before we can be together," he had explained. "Divorce issues, paperwork, you understand. But trust me, I'll come get you in a few days and we'll take the baby to a safe place." Carla had believed him. When Edward showed up at her motel 3 days after the birth, she handed over her child with confidence, believing her difficult life was finally coming to an end. "I'll take care of him as if he were my own blood," Edward had promised, taking the child wrapped in the white cloth she herself had embroidered with so much love. That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, Edward hadn't answered her calls, hadn't appeared at the addresses he had given her, and had simply vanished from her life as if he had never existed. Carla had tried to find him at his companies, but security guards prevented her from entering, treating her like a dangerous intruder. It was when she saw the news in the paper that the terrible truth began to dawn on her. Edward was offering a reward for information about a kidnapped baby. But how could it be a kidnapping if he himself had taken the child? "He lied," Carla whispered to the empty motel room, hot tears streaming down her face. "He never intended to take care of our son. He did something terrible." The pain she felt was not just emotional, it was physical, visceral, as if someone had ripped out a part of her soul. Carla had carried that baby for 9 months, had felt every kick, every hiccup, every little sign of life. And now she didn't even know if her son was alive, but along with the pain, a fierce determination began to grow inside her. Edward Montgomery might have money, power, and influence, but she had something he would never have: a mother's unconditional love for her child. Carla got up from the narrow bed and began to pack a small bag with her few belongings. If Edward was looking for a kidnapped baby, it meant the child was alive and someone had found him. She was going to find out the truth, no matter what it took. Over the next few hours, Carla visited every hospital, police station, and orphanage in the area, looking for any information about a newborn baby who had recently appeared. It was during one of these visits that an elderly nurse, touched by Carla's desperate story, whispered a precious piece of information. "I heard rumors that a rural family found an abandoned baby in the woods," the nurse said, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "I don't know if it's true, but if it were my son, I'd check." Carla felt her heart pound. The woods, that was exactly the kind of place where Edward might have abandoned a child he considered a problem. "Which family?" she asked, trying to control the urgency in her voice. "I'm not sure," the nurse replied, "but I know there are investigators asking questions in that rural area. Maybe you should go there too." As Carla left the hospital with a new spark of hope shining in her eyes, she had no idea she was about to enter a battle where a mother's love would clash with the power of a rich and desperate man. Tempest, grazing peacefully near the house where Hope slept safely in Mary Ann's arms, raised his head as if sensing that important changes were on the way. The horse neighed softly, as if promising to protect the child against any threat that dared to approach. The tension in the small rural community had become palpable. Throughout the week, Edward's investigators had intensified their visits, asking increasingly specific questions and offering ever larger rewards for information about the kidnapped child. Some residents began to whisper among themselves, speculating about families who might be hiding secrets. John Carter felt the weight of the situation with each passing day. At work, colleagues commented on the city investigators who were turning the area upside down. At home, Mary Ann had become even more protective of Hope, rarely going out and always checking the windows when she heard cars approaching. It was on a Friday morning that everything began to change. Carla had arrived in the area in the early hours, driving a borrowed car that barely ran. She had spent the night sleeping in the vehicle, parked on a back road, gathering the courage to begin her own investigation. Unlike Edward's investigators, Carla had a completely different approach. Instead of veiled threats and intimidating questions, she simply told her story, a desperate young mother searching for the son she had been tricked out of by a powerful man. The first person who listened to her was Ms. Ilara, a 70-year-old woman who lived alone in a small pink house at the entrance to the area. Carla knocked on her door at 8 in the morning, her eyes red from crying and a crumpled photo of the baby in her hands. "Please, ma'am," Carla said, her voice filled with genuine desperation. "I'm looking for my son. He's 3 weeks old. A man tricked me, promised to take care of him, but now I've found out he abandoned him somewhere in this area." Ms. Ilara, who had raised 8 children and knew a mother's suffering, invited Carla in and offered her coffee. As the young woman told her story through tears, the elderly woman's heart broke. "My dear," Ms. Ilara said, holding Carla's hands in hers, "there are rumors that a family here found a baby in the woods. I don't know if it's true, but John Carter and Mary Ann always wanted to have children." The Carter's name reached Carla's ears like a revelation. She asked for directions, and half an hour later, she was walking down the dirt road leading to the light blue house where Hope had been living for nearly a month. When Carla saw the property, her heart raced. There were baby clothes drying on the line, tiny nightgowns and diapers swaying gently in the morning breeze. Tempest was grazing near the house, and when he saw the stranger approaching, the horse strategically positioned himself between her and the residents. Mary Ann was in the kitchen preparing Hope's morning bottle when she saw a young woman walking toward the house through the window. Something in the woman's posture, a mix of determination and despair, made Mary Ann's chest tighten. Carla stopped a few feet from the front door, gathering her courage. When Mary Ann appeared on the threshold, the two women looked at each other in silence for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. Mary Ann was holding Hope in her arms, and Carla immediately recognized the features she had memorized during 9 months of pregnancy. "It's her," Carla whispered, tears instantly welling up. "It's my daughter." Mary Ann felt as though the world had stopped spinning. Instinctively, she clutched Hope tighter, but she couldn't deny what she saw. The resemblance between the young woman before her and the child in her arms was undeniable. You're her mother?" Mary Ann asked, her voice trembling. "I am," Carla replied, taking a hesitant step toward the door. "Edward Montgomery, her father, told me he would take care of her, but then I found out he's offering a reward for a kidnapped baby. I realized he tricked me and abandoned my daughter." The name Edward Montgomery landed like a bomb. Mary Ann had heard that name in the news, a wealthy and influential businessman. Suddenly, it all started to make sense. The baby abandoned in an isolated house. The investigators searching for a kidnapped baby, the reward being offered. John, who had come home early from work, appeared behind Mary Ann. When he saw the scene, his wife holding Hope, while a young woman cried at the door. He knew instantly that the moment they had been dreading had arrived. "Come in," John said softly. "I think we need to talk." As Carla entered the house, where her daughter had been loved and protected for nearly a month, Tempest approached the kitchen window. The horse seemed to understand that something fundamental was about to change in the life of the child he had saved and protected from the very first moment. Outside, unbeknownst to anyone, one of Edward's investigators was watching the scene through binoculars from a nearby hill. Rick Miller had noticed the arrival of the unknown young woman and decided to keep a discreet watch on the Carter property. When he saw through his lens one woman handing a baby to another, he knew he had found exactly what Edward Montgomery was looking for. He took out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Mr. Montgomery," he said when the call was answered, "we've found the child." The conversation in the Carters' living room lasted for 3 hours and changed the lives of everyone present forever. Carla told her full story, from her relationship with Edward to the moment she realized she had been deceived. John and Mary Ann recounted how they had found hope in the abandoned homestead, thanks to Tempest's desperate nays. "He promised he would take care of her," Carla said through tears, watching as Mary Ann held her daughter with infinite affection. "He said he would give me a house, stability, that we would be a family. But it was all a lie. He just wanted me to disappear, along with the evidence of our relationship." Mary Ann's heart broke as she listened to the young mother's story. She recognized in Carla the same desperate love she herself felt for Hope, and she understood the pain of a forced separation. "You have every right to be with your daughter," Mary Ann said, though each word cost her a piece of her soul. John watched the two women with a mix of admiration and sadness. But we need to think about what's best for Hope," he said carefully. "Edward Montgomery is a powerful man. If he was capable of abandoning his own daughter in a forest, what else would he be capable of?" It was at that moment that the sound of approaching cars interrupted the conversation. Through the window, they saw 2 black SUVs pulling up in front of the house. The investigators had arrived, and this time they were not alone. Edward Montgomery himself stepped out of the first car, his face a mask of cold determination. "He's here," Carla whispered, turning pale. "It's Edward. What are we going to do?" John stood up immediately, his protective instincts kicking in. "Mary Ann, take Hope and Carla to the back room. I'll handle this." But before they could move, authoritative knocks echoed on the front door. "Police, open the door immediately," a man's voice shouted. Edward had brought 2 local deputies, men he had bought with favors and donations to election campaigns. Rick Miller stood beside them, holding a camera to document the entire rescue operation. John opened the door slowly, meeting Edward Montgomery's icy gaze. It was the first time he had seen the man in person, and it was shocking to realize how someone so refined in appearance could harbor such cruelty. "Mr. Carter," one of the deputies said, "we have information that you are illegally holding a kidnapped child. We need to search the property." "What kidnapping?" John replied firmly. "This is my home, and you can't come in without a warrant." Edward took a step forward, his voice laced with false authority. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. We know you found a baby and decided to keep her. While we understand the good intentions, that constitutes a crime." It was then that Carla appeared at the door, holding Hope in her arms. Her presence caused a stunned silence. Edward recognized her immediately, and for the first time in weeks, something akin to fear flickered in his eyes. "Hello, Edward," Carla said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I've come for our daughter, the one you promised to take care of. Remember?" The confusion on the deputies' faces was palpable. They had been told about a kidnapping, but now they were faced with a young woman who clearly knew the child's father and spoke of broken promises. "Carla," Edward said, trying to maintain his composure, "you're confused. We never..." "Never what?" Carla interrupted, taking a step toward him. "Never had a relationship. Never made plans for our daughter. never promised me a house where we could live together as a family. Rick Miller, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, tried to intervene. Officers, this woman is clearly distraught. We need to focus on recovering the kidnapped child. But Mary Ann Carter had reached her limit. Stepping out from behind her husband, she confronted Edward with a maternal fury that stunned everyone present. "Kidnapped," she cried. "Kidnapped by who? By the man who left her to die in a rotting house? By the horse that protected her all night until we came? Or by the family who has loved her as our own daughter?" Tempest, who had been watching the entire situation from a distance, began to approach slowly. The horse seemed to sense the tension and the threat hanging over the child he considered his charge. One of the deputies, an older man with decades of experience, began to realize he had been deceived. "Mr. Montgomery," he said carefully, "I need to understand this situation better. This young woman claims to be the child's mother and that you promised to care for her." Edward felt his carefully constructed lies beginning to crumble. He looked at Carla, holding the daughter he had tried to eliminate, at the couple who had thwarted his plans by saving the child, and at the white horse approaching like a living symbol of his failed cruelty. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, but his voice no longer carried the same authority. "This woman is obviously disturbed, and the only thing disturbed here," Carla cut in with newfound courage, "is a man capable of abandoning his own daughter in a forest to die, just to protect his reputation." The confrontation had only just begun, but everyone present could feel that the truth was finally starting to emerge from the shadows where Edward had kept it hidden. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The more experienced officer, Sergeant Davis, had worked in the region for 25 years and had developed a keen instinct for detecting lies. Something in Edward Montgomery's story wasn't adding up, especially with the young mother confronting him directly about broken promises. "Mr. Montgomery," the sergeant said, "before we proceed, I need to clarify some contradictions. You filed a police report about a kidnapped child, but this young woman claims to be the mother and that you promised to care for the child." Edward felt a cold sweat run down his back. His calculating eyes worked furiously, searching for an escape that would preserve his version of events. "Sergeant, this woman was unstable after the birth. She was saying things that weren't true. I was trying to help her when the child disappeared." Carla let out a bitter laugh, a sound that cut through the air like a cry of pain. "Unstable? Edward, you have photos on your phone. You have the text messages you sent me. You have the keys to the apartment you promised me." The mention of concrete evidence made Edward turn pale. He had been careful, but not as careful as he'd thought. Carla pulled out her own cell phone, a simple, older model, but one that had stored every message, every promise, every documented lie. "Here," she said, holding the phone out to the sergeant. "Read his messages. See the promises about our happy family, about how he would care for our daughter as if she were his own blood." Mary Ann watched the scene with a broken heart. She held hope tighter against her chest, realizing that the child who had become her reason for living was at the center of a battle that could destroy many lives. The sergeant began to read the messages on Carla's phone, and his expression gradually shifted from neutral to shocked. There was clear evidence of a relationship, promises of care, even photos Edward had sent of potential houses where Carla and the baby could live. "Mr. Montgomery," the sergeant said, looking up from the phone, "these messages seem to completely contradict your kidnapping story." It was at that moment that Tempest did something extraordinary. The horse had slowly approached throughout the argument, and now he positioned himself directly between Edward and the group protecting Hope. His nostrils flared as he scented the man who had abandoned the child, and a low, menacing rumble came from his throat. "Even the horse recognizes him." John Carter said, amazed at his companion's intelligence. Tempest was the one who found Hope. He's the one who called us. And now he's protecting us from the man who left her. Tempest's behavior did not go unnoticed by Sergeant Davis, who had grown up on a farm and knew animal behavior well. Horses didn't react like that without reason, especially not a horse as clearly well-trained and calm as this one. Edward, desperate, played his last card. Sergeant, you can't take the word of an unstable woman over mine. I am Edward Montgomery. I have a reputation, businesses, social responsibilities, which is exactly why you did what you did. Mary Ann cut in, her voice laced with indignation. Because your precious reputation was more important than the life of an innocent child. Carla took a step forward, her courage growing with every moment. Edward, I cleaned your offices for 2 years. I saw how you treat people you consider beneath you. To you, I was just some fun, and our daughter was a threat to your perfect image. The second deputy, who had remained silent, finally spoke up. Mr. Montgomery, if there's evidence that you had voluntary custody of this child and then abandoned her, that doesn't constitute kidnapping by this family. That constitutes child abandonment on your part. The reality of the situation finally hit Edward like a hammer. His lies were unraveling, his influence was useless in the face of concrete evidence, and he was being publicly confronted with the truth he had tried to hide. Rick Miller, realizing his investigation had turned into a public expose of his client, tried to mitigate the damage. Mr. Montgomery, perhaps we should reconsider our position. If there was a misunderstanding— There was no misunderstanding, Carla said firmly, looking directly into Edward's eyes. There was an attempt to eliminate an innocent child to protect the reputation of a man who has no character. Hope, as if sensing all the tension around her, began to cry softly. Immediately, both Carla and Mary Ann moved to comfort her, and in that moment of shared affection, something in the air shifted. Sergeant Davis closed Carla's phone and looked at Edward with an expression that mixed disappointment and professional resolve. Mr. Montgomery, I'm going to need you to come with me to the station. We have several matters to clear up, including possible child abandonment and misuse of police authority. Edward Montgomery, the man who had built an empire on image and power, was finally facing the consequences of his cruelty, and ironically, it was a white horse, moved by a compassion he never possessed, that had started the chain of events that now led to his ruin. 3 days after the confrontation that changed everything, the Carters' light blue house had become a sanctuary for deep conversations and decisions that would alter the fate of everyone involved. Carla had spent those nights sleeping in the guest room, getting to know her daughter day by day, hour by hour, making up for lost time with an intensity that deeply touched John and Mary Ann's hearts. The news of Edward Montgomery's arrest had spread through the region like wildfire. The businessman was facing charges of child abandonment, misuse of police authority, and obstruction of justice. His carefully built reputation was rapidly crumbling, and his business partners were beginning to publicly distance themselves from him. Sitting on the porch, watching Tempest graze peacefully while Hope slept in Carla's lap, the two women who had become mothers to the same child talked about the future with a maturity that surprised even themselves. I don't know how to thank you, Carla said, gently adjusting the blanket around Hope. You saved my daughter when I couldn't protect her. You gave her love when I didn't even know where she was. Mary Ann held Carla's hand warmly. You have nothing to thank us for. Any mother would have done what you did. Edward tricked you, took advantage of your youth and need. The fault was never yours. During those 3 intense days, something extraordinary had happened. Instead of competing for the child, Carla and Mary Ann had discovered they could be allies in raising Hope. Carla recognized that, at 19 and with no resources, she needed support to give her daughter the stability she deserved. Mary Ann and John, in turn, had fallen genuinely in love with Hope and couldn't imagine their lives without her. I have a proposal, Carla said after a long, contemplative silence. I know this might sound strange, but what if we raised Hope together? Mary Ann raised her eyebrows, interested but cautious. What do you mean? You have a stable home, life experience, resources I don't have. I have youth, determination, and a mother's biological love. Hope doesn't have to choose between us. She can have the best of both worlds. The idea was revolutionary for the small rural community, but it made sense in a way that deeply touched the hearts of everyone involved. John, who had been listening to the conversation from the kitchen where he was making coffee, joined the two women on the porch. Carla, he said carefully, are you suggesting shared custody? More than that, Carla replied, looking at Hope with infinite love. I'm suggesting we become a non-traditional family, but a real family. You would be the parents she needs now, and I would be like her older sister until I'm ready to take on motherhood fully. Mary Ann felt tears well up in her eyes. Carla's generosity and maturity impressed her deeply. And you? What would you do? Where would you live? There's a nursing school in the next town where I can study. I've always wanted to work taking care of people. Would you let me visit Hope whenever I can? Would you help me become the mother she deserves? The proposal was both simple and complex, practical and emotionally charged. It meant that Hope would grow up knowing the truth about her origins, but surrounded by the love of three people who put her above their own desires. Tempest approached the porch at that moment, as if sensing the importance of the conversation. The horse stretched his neck toward Hope, gently sniffing the child he had saved, and who was now safe among the people who loved her. Look, Mary Ann whispered, even Tempest approves. John sat beside the two women, looking out at his simple but happy property. Carla, are you sure? This means you'd be giving up legal custody of Hope. At least for now. I'm not giving her up, Carla corrected with determination. I'm choosing what's best for her. Edward tried to make me believe I wasn't worthy of being a mother because I was poor and young. But being a mother means making hard choices for your children's sake. The conversation continued until dusk, when they finally reached an agreement that satisfied everyone's hearts. Hope would stay with John and Mary Ann, who would be her legal and day-to-day parents. Carla would study and visit whenever possible, maintaining her maternal bond and preparing for a future when she could take on greater responsibility. Most importantly, Hope would grow up knowing the whole truth about Carla, about Edward, about John and Mary Ann, and about the white horse who had been her first protector. She would know she was loved enough to be saved, protected, and fought for by people who put her well-being above all else. As night fell on the light blue house, 3 adults and 1 child had become a unique family, bound not by blood or law, but by the deliberate choice to love unconditionally. And Tempest, grazing under the stars, neighed softly, as if celebrating the happy ending his protective instinct had made possible. 6 months later, life had found a harmonious rhythm that no one could have imagined on that terrible night when an innocent child was abandoned in a rotting house. Autumn painted the rural landscape with hues of gold and red, and the Carters' light blue house seemed to radiate a happiness that was contagious to everyone around. Hope had grown into a cheerful, healthy baby, 6 months old and filled with love and care. Her brown eyes shone with intelligence, and she had begun to crawl around the house, always under the watchful eye of Tempest, who had become her official guardian and inseparable companion. The white horse had developed an extraordinary connection with the girl. Every morning, when Mary Ann took Hope out for some sun in the garden, Tempest would approach and carefully lie down beside the blanket where she played. It was as if the animal understood that this child was special, that he had been chosen by fate to protect her. Carla had moved to the neighboring town where she was studying at a nursing school, but she visited Hope every weekend. The young woman had blossomed during these months, gaining self-confidence and discovering talents she never knew she had. Her instructors constantly praised her for her dedication and natural compassion in patient care. "She has a gift," the course coordinator had told Mary Ann during a visit to the school. "Carla has a special sensitivity for understanding others, suffering, and turning it into healing. She will be an exceptional nurse." John had converted part of the barn into a workshop where he built wooden toys for Hope. Each piece was made with meticulous love and care: rocking horses, building blocks, simple but charming dolls. He had discovered a passion for woodworking he never knew he possessed. The rural community had embraced the non-traditional family's story. Miss Ilara, who had been the first to hear Carla's account, had become a sort of honorary grandmother to Hope. Other neighbors regularly contributed clothes, food, and offers of help whenever needed. Edward Montgomery had lost everything. His businesses collapsed when the truth about his character came to light, and he faced not only criminal charges but also complete social ostracism. Ironically, his financial ruin had forced him to do community service as part of his sentence, where he was slowly learning the value of humility and serving others. "It's strange," Carla had commented during one of her visits, "but I think what Edward did to Hope ended up being the best gift he could have given all of us. If he had kept his promises, I never would have met you, and Hope wouldn't have this beautiful family." On that special Saturday afternoon, 6 months after the rescue, the whole family was gathered in the garden. Hope had just taken her first steps, not toward John or Mary Ann, but by toddling determinedly toward Tempest, who was lying on the grass a few feet away. The moment was magical. The little girl, her dark hair shining in the golden sun, took 3 wobbly steps before grabbing onto Tempest's mane. The horse remained absolutely still, allowing her to use his neck for support, his large, intelligent eyes shining with something that could only be described as paternal pride. "She chose Tempest for her first steps," Mary Ann whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Of course she did," Carla laughed. "He was the first one to protect her. It's only fair. He's the first to witness this milestone." John documented the moment with the old camera his mother had left him, capturing for posterity the instant Hope took her first steps toward the animal that had changed all their destinies. The abandoned homestead in the woods had been transformed by the community into a children's library, a place where local kids could go to read and play. A plaque at the entrance read, "The Hope Library, where sad stories are turned into happy endings." As the sun set on that perfect afternoon, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold, the makeshift family gathered on the porch for dinner. Hope slept peacefully in Mary Ann's lap. Carla studied her nursing textbooks at the wooden table John had built, and Tempest grazed serenely near the window. "You know," Carla said, looking around the simple but happy table, "I used to think family was just about blood and DNA. But Hope taught me that family is about choice, about unconditional love, about the people who show up when you need them most." Mary Ann reached across the table and held Carla's hand. "And about white horses who hear crying in the middle of the woods and decide they just can't ignore it." John raised his coffee cup in an impromptu toast. To Tempest, for having the heart that Edward lost. To Carla, for having the courage many adults lack. To Mary Ann, for having the mother's love every child deserves. And to Hope, for teaching us that sometimes the most beautiful endings begin in the darkest of moments. Outside, Tempest raised his head as if he'd heard his name, and neighed softly, a sound no longer of desperation, but of deep contentment. The story that had begun with cruelty and abandonment ended with love, family, and the proof that kindness always finds a way to prevail, especially when it comes from the most unexpected of places, like the heart of a white horse who refused to ignore the cry of an innocent child.